Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Welcome to the course Introduction to Urban Planning. In today's session, we are going to cover evolution and growth of planning legislation, and today we are going to particularly look at the Indian context. So accordingly, our timeline would be covering pre-independence acts which came in, and then also the post-independence act. So the pre-independence act, which we shall briefly review upon, would include Sanitary Commission, Land Acquisition Act, also Bombay City Improvement Act, as well as Patrick Geddes' visit in India. We'll also look at the Bombay Town Planning Act, Rent Control Act, Uttar Pradesh Town Planning Act, Health Survey and Development Committee. We'll further look into the post-independence acts such as modern movement of town planning, new cities which were built during the period. We'll look at the industrial policy resolution. We will look at the 5-year plans all along. How did we move in the post-independence time? We will look at the Slum Area Improvement and Clearance Act, and then we'll also see the acts related with the monuments and conservation aspect. Further, we'll look into the Model Town Planning Act, then other regional and town planning acts such as Maharashtra Town Planning Act. We'll be also looking at Delhi Urban Art Commission, then Urban Land Ceiling Act, Model Regional and Town Planning Development, Environmental Protection Act, then also the Constitutional Amendment Acts which came in, and then we'll look at other guidelines which were developed in the time. We'll look at the URDPFI guidelines also in this timeline. Then we'll look at the other global level interventions which were taking place simultaneously, just to map them. And then we'll also look at the Disaster Management Act, and then SDG which came in, and then we'll look at the Land Acquisition and Rehabilitation Settlement Act. So what we will be covering today will be just looking through the timeline. The details of it, of the selective acts, we'll be covering in the later sessions. So accordingly, the learning outcomes which we'll be working on will be that you should be able to list all these acts, and you should be able to review them in the timeline, not only in the Indian context as well as in the global context, and also as per the details of the drawbacks which were coming, which were happening through these acts. So we see that in the middle of 19th century, there was increased pace of urbanization which produced a great shift of population from the rural to the urban areas, which led to insanitary condition, epidemics and growth of slums, resulting of which there was conceptualization of Sanitary Commission in 1864. The Sanitary Commission was organized in February 1864. It was organized to give effect to the 39 articles recommendations which the Commission came up with in order to deal with the problems of the army in India in May 1859. So based on their review, they published a report in 1863. Based on those reports and the recommendations, Sanitary Commission was organized. So looking at the timeline, we see that Sanitary Commission was formulated in 1864. Further, we see that the planning legislation in India was essentially confined to building bylaws and building regulation. As you can see that our focus was on the health. There were few States Act and City Acts, but had limited roles and were not exhaustive. Around the same time, in 1848, we see Britain had brought Public Health Act, which was not compulsory. People were not willing to charge or pay for the cost of the services. And we also see in 1855, if you may recollect, we saw the first model tenement was built in Manhattan when we reviewed the US timeline. We also see in 1864, New York Council of Hygiene of Citizens Association mounted a campaign to raise housing and sanitary standards. Then in 1894, we see Land Acquisition Act. According to the writing of Professor Daniel, in the publication Land Acquisition in India, Past and Present, published in 2016, while he reviews the Land Acquisition Act, he mentions that the history of land acquisition began with the Bengal Regulation of 1824 to promote British commercial interest. So we see that how their commercial interest was catered through the Land Acquisition Act. Through this particular act, land for construction of railway was acquired. According to the review, another review we see by Bakshi published in 2012, in the publication titled The Land Acquisition Debate a Review, we see that the author expresses that ever since its enactment, the Land Acquisition Act of 1894 has been subject to controversies and fierce debate. Notwithstanding rounds of amendments, including the 1984 changes, it had failed to address some important issues associated with the land acquisition. So there was a lot of criticism to that. Particularly, the criticism revolved around the definition of what constitute public purpose. Then we also see there was widespread misuse of the urgency clause in this particular thing, and then also there was lack of transparency in the acquisition process. Participation of communities whose land was being taken, acquired, was virtually not there. And further, we also see that there was no plan for rehabilitation, and there was no provision for resettlement package. Further, we see that there was weak implementation and ineffective administration at the ground level has also increased in this time, causing a lot of suffering and anguish among the people. And due to the lack of clear definition of the public purpose, there has been considerable difference of opinion among various judgments of the Supreme Court, finally resulting into granting very broad discretionary powers to the state in terms of deciding the contours of public purpose under particular circumstances. So all these factors, coupled with the urgent need to industrialize, so you will also see that we were industrializing at that time, had put land acquisition at the, like it was the key debate in the country. So the act went several revision, and the latest one is in 2013, which we'll be covering in detail in the following lectures. Further, we see in 1896-97, we witnessed Bombay Plague, which again brought in constructive changes in the planning legislation in the Indian landscape. As per the writing of Kedambi in 2001, as per the Kedambi's writing in 2001, one of the major consequences of the concern was the formation of the City Improvement Act (CIT) in 1898, with the express intention of clearing the city of its insanitary areas and mitigating the problems caused by the terrible living conditions of the poor. So we had seen all this in our public health sessions as well. And we see that because of this, in December 9th, 1898, we see that Mumbai plague epidemic, through the act of parliament, the municipal corporation and the government handed over all vacant lands to this body, CIT. And CIT undertook a host of measures to improve sanitary and living conditions in the city. So we see that the planned opening up of the suburb was due to this trust. We further see Professor Dossel in 1999 wrote about that CIT during the first decade of its existence undertook nearly more than 30 projects in order to improve the conditions. Further, we see as per the publication and planning perspective in 2013, Bombay City Improvement Trust eventually inspired the establishment of similar trust in other Indian cities, initially in Kolkata in 1911, then we see notably in Kanpur in 1919, then in Lahore in 1936 and Delhi 1937. Further in the timeline, we see Sir Patrick Gaddis' visit in India from 1914 to 24. His visit had considerable influence in practice of town planning. Till this time, we see in our context that piecemeal development was taken up, like slum improvement, then we also see road scheme and then area development. So piecemeal approach was adopted. It was Sir Patrick's suggestion that we should go for comprehensive plan for cities. He emphasized that there is a need for town planning legislation. Further, we see that following this, we see the Bombay Town Planning Act came in 1915. We see Uttar Pradesh Town Planning Act came in 1919. Further, we see Madras Town Planning Act came in 1920. Looking at Bombay Town Planning Act of 1915, we see that it was the first town planning legislation enacted under the Bombay Town Planning Act of 1915. It aimed at providing the local authorities the most valuable powers, such as to control the future growth of the town, power to prevent formation of slums, to provide healthy dwellings, furthermore to take active measures to make life more comfortable for the poor and the middle class people. Then we see Rent Control Act in 1918. Rent control in India was introduced to prevent pseudo scarcity of rental housing post World War II. In India, first rent control legislation was introduced immediately after the First World War in Bombay in 1918, followed by similar legislation in Kolkata in 1920. Through this Rent Control Act, we see that control was imposed upon the lease of vacant buildings to tenant for desirable rented accommodation. There was fixation of fair and standard rents. We also see there was protection of tenants against arbitrary eviction. There was also maintenance and upkeep of rental properties by landlords. We also see rights to landlords against defaulter tenants. Also, we see there was provision for rights to landlords for the recovery of the premises in specific cases. A review of the effects of Rent Control Act indicates that there was, because of this Control Act, there was reduction in investment in rental housing. So these are some of the negative impact we see. It accelerated deterioration in the controlled housing stocks, as landlords have no incentives to spend. So we see the quality going down. There was decrease in municipal revenue. We further see there were withdrawal of vacant premises from the rental market, as well as we see distortion in the price, which led to inefficient land use. Furthermore, the reviewers also show that there was reduction in the mobility of households and laborers. Further, we see reduction in liquidity in household marketing. Then there was also activation of parallel economy through key money. Further, we see Uttar Pradesh Town Planning Act came in 1919. Also, the Madras Town Planning Act in 1920, you can see in the timeline. It was the first time that urban issues were included in the urban policy. The act shaped the development scheme for municipal and other local areas within urban centers. There was assigned use of land parcels, and regulations were specified to supervise each type of development. Then we see in 1943, Health Survey and Development Committee was appointed in the year with Sir Joseph Bore as its chairman. It was established to look into adaptability of Town Planning Act in various states, and following policies were outlined. See, the policies included this committee, known as the Health Survey and Development Committee, was appointed in 1943 with Sir Joseph Bore as its chairman. It laid emphasis on integration of curative and preventive medicines at all the levels. It made comprehensive recommendations for remodeling of health services in India. So there we see it focused on what kind of infrastructure has to come up. Their report, the report which they submitted in 1946, had some important recommendations. The recommendation included integration of preventive and curative services of all administrative levels. Further, they recommended development of primary health centers in 2 stages. One was short-term measures, which included primary health centers for a population of 40,000 or so, and each primary health center was to manned by 2 doctors and so on. Further, they suggested for secondary health centers. We see the other component was the long-term program, which is also called as 3 million plan. This plan involved setting up of primary health units with 75 bedded hospitals for each 10,000 to 20,000 population, and secondary units with 650 bedded hospitals and so on. The major changes in the medical education, which included 3 months training in preventive and social medicine to prepare social physicians. So that all was recommended by the Bore Committee. We now come to the time of post-independence. So this was right before the independence. We see in the post-independence time, many cities were built along the lines of modernism, as you may recollect. We can see Bhubaneswar in 1948. We also see Industrial Policy Resolution of 1948. It defined the broad contour of the policy delineating the role of state in industrial development, both as an entrepreneur and authority. It made clear that India is going to have a mixed economic model. So we see that the Industrial Policy Resolution came in 1948, and we were still an agrarian nation, and then we were looking forward to the mixed economic model at that time. In this time, we further see that we started 5-year plans. Though the planned economic development in India had begun way before this time. For example, we can see that there was National Planning Committee by Indian National Congress in 1938. We also see the Bombay Plan and Gandhian Plan in 1944. We also see People's Plan in 1945, and also see Sarvodaya Plan in 1950 by Jayaprakash Narayan. These were the steps where we were trying to get into planning. So before we really started into 5-year plans. 5-year plan was prepared by Planning Commission, and now we see that it has been replaced by Niti Aayog. Planning Commission, for the socio-economic development of the country, the Government of India enacted an organization known as Planning Commission in 1950. Under the Planning Commission, the 5-year plan of India was formulated. The 5-year plan is a plan document constructed on the basis of recommendations made by a large number of working groups which deal with a major sector of economic activities. It lays down broad strategies, objectives of the growth of various socio-economic sectors in the country. So you may also see it like a perspective plan, example of perspective plan. The Planning Commission was headed by the chairman. The Prime Minister was the chairman of the commission. You can look at the structure of Planning Commission then. You are looking at the picture of Planning Commission headed by then Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru. The Planning Commission had following task. The task involved to assess material, capital and human resources of the country, including technical, personnel, and investigate the possibilities of augmenting deficient resources for the nation's requirements. The task also involved to formulate a plan for most effective and balanced utilization of country's resources. Further, we see the task involved to define the stages in which the plan should be carried out and propose the allocation of resources for due completion at each stage. Further, we see the task involved indication of the factors which slow down economic development and determine the conditions needed to be established for the successful execution of the plan. Furthermore, we see the task involved to appraise from time to time the progress achieved in the execution of each stage of the plan and recommend for adjustment of the policies. We see that the principal task of Planning Commission is to formulate 5-year plan and annual plan for the most effective and balanced utilization of the country's material, capital and human resources, and to appraise from time to time the progress in their implementation and recommend adjustment of necessary policy and measures. So, you see the structural plan coming in here. The Planning Commission coordinated and oversaw the development programs of the central ministries and state governments and integrated these in the national plan. Further, we see annual plans were also operational plans that summed up the total outlay of the center and the state in a consistent manner. Now, looking at briefly at the 5-year plans alongside formulation of acts in Indian landscape, we see that 5-year plan were centralized and integrated national economic programs. Joseph Stalin implemented the first 5-year plan in Soviet Union in the late 1920s. Most communist states and several capitalist countries subsequently have adopted them. China and India both continue to use 5-year plans for quite some time, and China had renamed their 5-year plan as guidelines, calling it Guawa rather than a plan Jua, to signify the central government more hands-off approach to the development. Let us briefly look into how our approach as a nation evolves. You may also see this from the lens of perspective plan. The first 5-year period was from 1951 to 56, and the target growth was 2.1% and the actual growth attained was 3.6%. The plan was a successful plan given favorable agriculture produce in 2 years of the plan. The plan was based on Harrod-Domer model developed by Professor Harrod and Professor Domer. This model is based on Keynesian saving investment analysis. We have also looked into Keynesian model of planning. Harrod and Domer assign a crucial role to capital accumulation in the process of growth. So, we focused more on the savings at that point in time. In the beginning of the plan period, we as a nation were dealing with influx of refugees, as well as we were dealing with severe food shortage, plus there was rising inflation. The plan focused on agriculture, it was focusing on stabilizing the prices, and then it was also looking at how to invest in power and transportation at that time. The plan was successful and the objectives of rehabilitation of refugees, food self-sufficiency and control of prices were considerably attained in this plan. You may recollect creation of Faridabad township. You may also recollect several large rehabilitation colonies such as Lajpat Nagar, Kalkaji Amar Colony, Malviya Nagar, developed by the Ministry of Rehabilitation to provide accommodation for displaced persons after the independence of the country in South Delhi, covered in our lecture of local area plan where we dealt with the zonal plan of Delhi. You can see Lajpat Nagar, Kalkaji and Amar Colony. You may also recollect we saw the planning of Chandigarh, which was finalized by Le Corbusier in 1951. Moving forward, in 1956, we started our second plan period from 1956 to 61, which is also called Mahalanobis plan, as it was based on the Professor M.C. Mahalanobis model. In this period, Harrod-Domer model was also adopted. The target growth was 4.5% and actual attained growth was 4.3%, which was very close to the target. The slight shortfall is said to be because of the shortage of forex and high inflation at that time. The beginning of the period indicated economic stability, so we were seeing positive direction, and the industrialization was brought to focus compared to agriculture at that time. In this period, huge imports through foreign loans were advocated, encouraged. We see industrial policy of 1956 at this time. Government revised its first industrial policy, that's the policy of 1948, through the industrial policy of 1956. It was regarded as the economic constitution of India, or the Bibles of state capitalism. The major criticism which we see about this industrial policy of 1956 was that there was sharp criticism from the private sector in particular, since this resolution reduced the scope of expansion of private sector significantly. The sector was kept under the state control through a system of licensing. So there was a lot of control of the state at that point in time. We see that this second five-year plan provided guidance for planning, particularly for preparation of plans of large cities, organizing planning activities, as well as we see the regional plan for industrial and river valley projects were guided at this point in time. We shall be seeing industrial policy in detail in the later sessions. In the same time, we see formation of Slum Area Improvement and Clearance Act of 1956. So we are seeing how industrial towns and all are increasing, how there's rapid industrialization, and we also see coming up of slum and then the relevant act for it. As per the act, the slum clearance meant clearance of any slum area by demolition and removal of buildings thereof, and it focused on work of improvement, necessary repair, structural alteration, provision of light points, water taps, bathing places. It also focused on construction of drains, open and covered drains, provision of toilets, including conversion of dry toilets into waterborne toilets. It also focused on provision of additional and improved fixtures or fittings, opening up or paving of the courtyards, removal of trash, and similar other activities. Further, we see in this timeline that Ancient Monument and Archaeological Sites and Remain Validation Act came in 1958. This act came in particularly to preserve ancient monuments, archaeological sites and remains, and to reduce further damages to them. This act facilitated acquisition of rights in the protected monuments. It also encouraged preservation of protected monuments by agreement, maintenance of certain protected monuments, right to access protected monuments, and restriction on the enjoyment of the property rights. Moving forward in the timeline, we see third five-year plan period from 1961 to 66. The target growth was 5.6%. At the inception of the plan period, the environment was good and considered favorable for economic takeoff. Therefore, the country targeted for self-reliant and self-generating economy. Agriculture was given top priority to support the export and industry at this time. The nation achieved growth rate of 2.8%. The plan failed in attaining the target due to the unprecedented events of Chinese aggression in 1962, Indo-Pak war in 1965, and drought in 1965 and 66. Because of this, the focus was shifted from development to defense and development. We see that in this third five-year plan, there was enactment of town planning legislation. There was also, the fund was also provided for urban area planning, industrial town, capital town, port towns and other cities for preparation of master plan, and it was supported by legislation. We see at the national level, two bodies were constituted during the second and third year plans to provide guidelines for planning urban development. We see Committee of Planning Projects, COP. We also see Bureau of Public Enterprise, BOP. Then we also see ITPI, Institute of Town Planning India, constituted in 1960, which prescribed model town planning legislation for all the states. We see that the Institute of Town Planners, which was founded in 1951 in India, drafted a Model Town Planning Act in 1960 and circulated it among all the states for implementation. It provided only the basic guidelines with regard to town planning legislation, leaving it to states for implementation to satisfy their requirements. We also see later in the timeline that in 1966 Maharashtra Regional and Town Planning Act came in, which was enacted to make provision for planning the development and use of land in proper manner. It aimed to make provision for the preparation of development plans with a view to ensure that town planning schemes are made in proper manner and their execution is made effective. This act made provision for creation of new towns by means of development authorities. Moving on in the timeline, we see that due to the failure of third five-year plan, Government of India did not implement the fourth five-year plan. The period for 1966 to 1969 was known as a plan holiday period. During this period, the annual plans were implemented, which emphasized on irrigation and agriculture sector due to agricultural crisis and food shortage. So we were having those problems at this time. It involved widespread distribution of high-yielding varieties of seeds, extensive use of fertilizers, and heavy irrigation and soil conservation. During these annual plans periods, we could absorb the shock of third and fifth year plan. It prepared us for the future growth. Moving on, we see the fourth five-year plan, the plan period for which was 1969 to 74. It refocused on growth stability and progressive achievements of self-reliance. So now we were focusing on self-reliance, and we see there was promotion of agriculture, and also we were trying to control population through family planning programs. You may study more about population in any of the demographic related subjects of planning. The target of fourth five-year plan was 5.7%. However, we achieved 3.3%, and probably the reason for this was due to refugee influx from Bangladesh before and after 1971 Indo-Pak War and continued inflation. Further in the period, we see formation of Delhi Urban Art Commission Act 1973. Act was formulated to promote qualities in urban environment which can enhance values of the community, to bring up and nurse attractiveness, aesthetic and functional utility of the community living and work, to preserve character and quality of man-made heritage by maintaining integrity of those areas, and so on. So we see that there was formation of Urban Art Commission. This Delhi Urban Art Commission, the functional responsibility of the commission involved advisory to the central and the local government, promotion and securing development and integrated urban conservation, and then scrutinizing and approving or rejecting or modifying proposals. Moving forward in the timeline, we see fifth five-year plan from 1974 to 79. This plan was launched amidst massive inflation due to the rise in oil prices. The focus of the plan was to remove poverty, Garibi Hatao, and attain self-reliance. The key instrument for development were income distribution and improvement in saving. There was emergency in 1975 and emphasis shifted to Pradhan Mantri 20-point program. This plan was terminated when Janata Party came to power in 1978. In this time, we also see formulation of Urban Land Sealing and Regulation Act 1976, which was applicable to 73 towns and cities. This particular act implied sealing on vacant land in urban agglomeration varying from 500 to 2000 square meter. Sealing limits applicable to peripheral areas ranging in width from 1 kilometer to 8 kilometer. Sealing on plinth area of all future dwelling units varying from 300 to 500 square meter, and so on. Looking at the issue of Urban Land Sealing and Regulation Act 1976, as per the reviews, We see the reviews says that there was sharp decline in the prices of vacant land, an increase of rents of existing apartments and bungalows. There was increase in real estate price, small land. Housing became exclusive public domain. Land, there was land speculation. Then we also see increase in the heights in buildings. We also see uncertainty in industrial development, expansion and diversification at this time. Moving forward in the timeline, we further see in the period of 1978-80 there was rolling plan. We see two sixth plan by Janta government, which was from 1978 to 1980. It focused employment in contrast to Nehru model, which was criticized for accumulation of power and income imbalance and increase in poverty. The government period lasted for 2 years only. Congress regained power and addressed the issue of poverty and creating enabling environment by expanding the economy. The sixth plan by Congress for the planned period 1980 to 85 targeted for growth rate of 5.2% and attained the growth rate of 5.7%. The plan focused on increase in national income, modernization of technology with focus on reduction in poverty and unemployment. We see schemes like TRISEM, IRDP and NREP focusing on skill and employment. These all schemes were initiated in the period. Even though there were famine condition and agriculture output was low, the targets were attained in this particular plan period. In this period, we also see that Town and Country Planning Organization, TCPO, formulated the Model Town and Country Planning Law in year 1960. This Model Act was revised by TCPO in the year 1985 as Model, Regional and Town Planning and Development Law to enact a comprehensive urban and regional planning legislation in all states and union territories. Moving in the timeline, we further see 7 5-year plan from 1985 to 90. The target growth was 5% and actual growth attained was 6%. The plan focused on agriculture with increase in production of food grains, increase in employment opportunities. In the same time, we see that our awareness about environment improves, and we see that Environmental Protection Act came in 1986. Environmental Protection Act EPA was enacted in 1986 with the objective of providing protection and improvement of the environment. It empowers the central government to establish authorities charged with the mandate of preventing environmental pollution in all its forms and to tackle specific environmental problems that are peculiar to different parts of the country. The Act is one of the most comprehensive legislation with the pretext to protection and improvement of the environment. So we'll see about all the environmental related act in our following lectures. Moving forward in the timeline, we see that the 8th 5-year plan was postponed for 2 years because of the political uncertainty at the center. The eventual plan period was from 1992 to 97, targeting growth rate of 5.5%, and it attained the growth rate of 6.8%. In this time, drastic policy measures were taken to control the economic situation, such as fiscal and economic reform, including liberalization under Prime Minister Shri P.V. Narasimha Rao. We see rapid economic growth in the period. We see high growth rate in agriculture. We also see high growth rate in manufacturing sector, as well as we see high growth rate in import and export and trade as well. The share of public sector in the total investment had declined in the liberalization period as particular of this concept. In this period, we also see model rent control legislation in 1992. We also see that 73rd and 74th Constitutional Amendment Act was also brought in this particular period. We also see the first urban development plans, formulation and implementation guidelines being introduced in year 1996. Moving on in the timeline, we see ninth five-year plan from 1997 to 2002, which now focused on growth and social justice and equality. Now we see how our focus is moving on. In this plan, we depended more on private sector and FDI, foreign direct investment, and state was playing a role of only the facilitator. State was involved more in sector like education, health and infrastructure. Priority was given to agriculture and rural development and poverty eradication. The target growth rate was 6.5% and the attained rate was 5.4%. Moving on in the timeline, we further see the 10 five-year plan from 2002 to 2007, which now focus monitorable targets on the key indicators. 11 indicators were identified at that time. The focus was also on the reduction in gender gap, particularly in literacy and difference in wage rates. The focus was also on reducing the infant and maternal mortality rates, also improving the literacy rate. Then focus was also on improving the access to potable drinking water, cleaning of major polluted rivers. And in this plan, the target growth was 8% and then the achievement was 7.6%. In this period, we see improved role of state and Panchayati Raj institutions since 73rd and 74th Constitutional Amendment Act was already here. The plan period also focused on balanced development of all states. At the same time, we see that Millennium Development Goals at the international level was introduced in 2000. Millennium Development Goals, which started a global effort in 2000 to tackle the indignity of poverty. The Millennium Development Goals established measurable, universally agreed objectives for tackling extreme poverty and hunger, preventing deadly diseases, and expanding primary education to all children, among other development priorities. Later, we see Sustainable Development Goals came in 2016. Furthermore, we see Disaster Management Act came in 2005. This act was enacted in the country in December 2005. It came into effect in aftermath of 2004 tsunami, when the country lost thousands of lives. Moving forward in the timeline, we see 11th five-year plan from 2007 to 2012. From here, we started focusing on faster and more inclusive growth after the UPA government came back to power to support the common man. India had emerged as one of the fastest growing economy by the end of 10th five-year plan. Saving and investment rates increased, industrialization responded well to the competition in the global economy. However, the growth was not considered inclusive, as data still showed low indicators for the ST and ST communities, such as there were high cases of poverty, malnutrition, mortality and unemployment. We see Sustainable Development Goals, which came in 2012. The Sustainable Development Goals. Moving forward in the timeline, we see 12th five-year plan, which was the last 12th five-year plan. The plan period was from 2012 to 2017. From here, we strengthened on the monitorable targets, and focus was on the faster, inclusive and sustainable development. We also see major emphasis on infrastructure in this particular five-year plan. In this period, we also see formulation of Land Acquisition, Rehabilitation and Resettlement Act of 2013, the right to fair compensation and transparency in land acquisition, Rehabilitation and Resettlement Act of 2013. We also see Smart City Mission starting from 2015 in the same timeline. We also see revised URDPFI guidelines, and then we also see Real Estate Regulation and Development Act of 2016. So, summarizing the timeline, what we had seen today. We looked at the pre-independence, what all acts came in, as well as we looked at the post-independence, the acts which came in at that time, and as well as we simultaneously tried to map the international events which were happening side by side, and international events which were happening. So we looked at the Sanitary Commission, we looked at the Land Acquisition Act, we looked at the Bombay City Improvement Act, we also looked at the Rental Control Act, we looked at the Uttar Pradesh Town Planning Act, as well as we looked at the Board Committee, we looked at the Industrial Policy Resolution, further we looked at all the 5-year plans, we looked at the Slum Area Improvement and Clearance Act, we looked at the Ancient Monuments and Archaeological Sites Model Town Planning Act, Maharashtra Regional and Town Planning Act, and then also the Urban Art Commission, then Urban Land Sealing Act. Then we looked at the environmental related acts, as well as we looked at the Constitutional Amendment Act, and we looked at the how the international agendas like Millennium Development Goal, Sustainable Development Goal influenced our planning approach as well. In the end, we also looked at the Land Acquisition, Rehabilitation and Resettlement Act. We would be covering selective acts in details in the following lectures. Our coverage was limited with the scope to make you aware of the topic. There are enormous readings and movies available to explore. Few are suggested here. This is not an extensive list. You may feel free to suggest more from your experience. Please feel free to ask questions. Let us know about your concerns you have. Do share your opinion, experiences, and suggestions. Looking forward to interacting and co-learning with you while exploring cities and urban planning. That's all for today. Thank you.